Matthew chapter 24, it actually doesn't end as far as what he's saying here until the end of chapter 25. So what this is normally called, and I don't think there's anything wrong with calling it this, is the Olivet Discourse. Now, the reason they call it that is because of where it's located. They're on the Mount of Olives when he's talking to him here in Matthew 24. But you may think, well, it's just Matthew 24. It actually goes all the way to the end of Matthew 25. So all of that is what you would call the Olivet Discourse, because if you go to Matthew 26, is where he actually leaves, or it says, and it came to pass in verse 1 of chapter 26, when Jesus had finished all these things, he said unto his disciples, ye know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is going to be betrayed. So we also see that when he gives this discourse of events, this is 2 days before he's crucified, because Jesus is crucified on the Sabbath. And which makes sense, because we were just talking about how he came in riding on the ass, which would have been basically on a Sunday, or Sunday, but the first day of the week, and then later on, obviously, he was going to be crucified that week. But anyway, I just want you to see that. So when we get in chapter 25, it's really continuing the same thoughts, okay? Which you're going to see that it does tie in, especially at the end of Matthew 24. There's a story between the wise servant and the evil servant. That's pretty much picked up, meaning that there's going to be 3 different stories dealing with that same thing in Matthew 25. But starting off here, we see Jesus talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And so in verse 1 of Matthew 24, it says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, Jesus just got done ripping the face of all the Pharisees and those of Israel in chapter 23, and that's where it says that your house is left unto you desolate. So in verse 38 of the chapter right before that, so just a couple verses before we get into chapter 24, it says, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. And so he's condemning them, but then they're saying, look at this temple, look how beautiful it is. And he's saying there's not going to be one stone left upon another. So sorry, Jews, but that wall that you're bouncing and waving back and forth, that's not a part of the temple. And I think most of them realize it's not part of the temple. But all that to say is that Daniel chapter 9, I know we already hit this when we were in Daniel chapter 9, but I do believe this is what it's talking about in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26. It says, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. Obviously, that's talking about his death and on the cross. It says, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay, so I believe that's what Jesus is talking about here. It hadn't happened yet, but it's going to happen in around 70 AD. So there's a lot of just history on that as far as what's going on with Titus and Rome taking out Jerusalem and taking out the temple. And obviously the temple was destroyed because it's not there anymore, and so that, I don't think there's any dispute that the temple was destroyed. But that's what he's hitting on here. And here's the thing, Luke 21 is really more so dealing with that. Go to Luke chapter 21. So if you're looking in the Gospels for a chapter on end times, you would look at Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. But what we're going to see is that Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are the same parallel passage, but Luke 21 is actually, it's spoken around the same time, and I'll show you that, but I believe it's hitting on the same events, but it's more so talking about the temple being destroyed and what was going to happen in the near future. Okay, so it's all future to what he's saying, but there's some that's going to be near future, and then there's going to be some that's going to be distant future. So in Luke 21, in verse 5, just to show you here that he says the same thing in Luke 21 and verse 5, it says, and as some spake of the temple, and at how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? And notice in verse 20, this is where when you read through Luke 21, it's a little more cryptic because it's not going to sound as clear as when you're reading Matthew 24 and Mark 13 as far as end times events. In Luke 21, verse 20, it says, "And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." And so when you're looking at Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, he's kind of hitting two things at once because they do parallel a little bit, meaning that about Jerusalem being trodden underfoot or Jerusalem being destroyed and stuff like that that's going on that happened in 70 AD, but also is a future prophecy going on. It's very clear in both those passages that he is touching on farther future events because he talks about the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Okay, that clearly didn't happen in 70 AD, and to say so is ridiculous. Okay, but all that to say is that there's a clear future, far future, that hasn't even happened in our day that's in all those passages. But I do believe Luke 21 is more so hitting on the temple and what's going to happen in the near future with Jerusalem. The reason why is because I believe Jesus is speaking in Luke 21 when he goes through that whole discourse. He's actually in the temple, and he's not at the Mount of Olives yet. Okay, so look down at Luke 21, verse 37. You don't really see that, and it never says that he went to the Mount of Olives in Luke 21. Okay, it never says like he was in the Mount of Olives with his disciples. It just says, that he was speaking. It says they asked him, so it doesn't even say like his disciples went to him and privately or anything like that. But in Luke 21, verse 37, it says, "And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives." So you don't see him going to the Mount of Olives or talking about him going to the Mount of Olives until after he just, basically Luke 21's done. Okay, so what you see is in Luke 21, he's still in the temple. Okay, so Matthew 24 hits on where he says, there's not going to be one stone left upon another. That's where he's at the temple, right? They're looking at the temple, they see all the nice stuff, and they're saying that. And Matthew 24 skips all the way to where he gets to the Mount of Olives. That's at night. It's nighttime. And actually what we'll see is that he's speaking privately to just some of his disciples. Okay, 4 of his disciples that he gives what we see in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And Luke 21 is basically to everybody. Okay, even the other people that are there in the temple. And you can imagine why it's a little more cryptic, because as we see, when it comes to when he talks to multitudes compared to when he talks to his disciples, which one's more clear? Always to his disciples. He would speak to the multitudes in what? Parables, dark sayings, but he'd speak to his disciples clearly. Okay? And so, I just want you to see that. So when you go to Luke 21, that's why it's kind of a little more cryptic. And listen, that's where all the false teaching is going to come from. Okay? That's where you're going to get the preterists coming in there. That's when you're going to get, the pre-tribbers. You're going to go to Luke 21 because it's going to not be as clear. Wouldn't you rather just go to the clear passage first and then try to figure out the hard one? That's the way you should do it, right? But I'll say this, Luke 21 does parallel Matthew 24 and Mark 13. I believe it's just more so geared towards that near future event that's coming and, kind of hitting on the far future, if that makes sense. So, but go to Matthew 24 again. And here's the thing, wouldn't it make sense that he'd be talking about the destruction of the temple when he's standing in the temple? And when he's on the Mount of Olives, there's a huge reason why he's standing on the Mount of Olives giving this discourse. Do you know where Jesus resurrected, or where he ascended up to the Father from? In Acts chapter 1, the Mount of Olives. And he said, what did the angel say? He's going to return just like he went. Right? And I'm paraphrasing that, but he went up in a cloud, remember? In Acts chapter 1, and they were on the Mount of Olives. And he's going to return in like fashion in a cloud, and I believe probably in the same place, because in Zechariah chapter 14, and I don't have this in my notes, but in Zechariah chapter 14, it talks about the Mount of Olives in the day of the Lord. And so Zechariah 14, it's the very first verse of Zechariah 14, it says, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee." In verse 4, it says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall be removed toward the north, and half of it toward the south." So there's a lot of prophecy dealing with the second coming, or the day of the Lord, dealing with the Mount of Olives. Okay? Whereas Luke 21 is more, they're in the temple. You can see how that more so is focusing on that that prophecy he just gave about how there's not going to be one stone left upon another. Okay, so near future, Luke 21, far future, Matthew 24, Mark 13. So that's interesting because you actually for the longest time I always thought Luke 21 was spoken at the same time. And basically you could look at it as like, well, the author is picking out different things from what he said. You know what I mean? Because it doesn't mean that Matthew wrote down every single little word that he said, right? So Luke's just picking out different pieces of the same sermon. Does that make sense? I always looked at it that way, but it makes a lot more sense that he was speaking to a whole multitude in Luke 21, and then privately this is what he said to his disciples. And then he's recapping a lot of what he said to them, but he's clarifying it. Okay? So in Matthew 24 and verse 3 it says, "And he sat upon the Mount of Olives," so it's clear where he's at. "The disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" So notice that in Matthew 24, they're specifically asking when is he coming, the sign of his coming and the end of the world. So you see how the questions that they're asking at the Mount of Olives are more so pointed towards the far future, as far as when he's coming in the clouds and the end of the world, where you look at Luke 21, and they're more saying, when shall these things be? What things? The things you were talking about when you said there's not going to be one stone left upon another. But he did lace in Luke 21 a little bit about the end of the world as well. Okay, and so you can see the pointed questions and which ones he's answering. And Mark 13, it gives you a little more clarity as far as who he's talking to. So notice that it says the disciples came unto him privately. So this is a private discussion. This isn't like the Sermon on the Mount where he's speaking to a great multitude of people. He's actually only speaking to 4. And so in Mark 13:3, it says, "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, what shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?" So, you know, it's very clear he's just privately talking to these 4. So Judas isn't even mentioned in here, okay? So he's talking to all saved people. And Mark 13, and you say, well, it's only the Jews, you know. It's just the Jews that are supposed to hear this. Well, in the end of Mark chapter 13, it says, "What I say unto you, I say unto all." Watch. So it's not saying that this is only for them. Well, if you're going to take it that far, it's only for those 4 people. Okay, it's only for them. How far do you take that stuff, right? But it's obviously to all of us. It applies to us. And it doesn't even apply to them because they're not even there anymore, right? They're long gone. So, but going back, to actually in Mark 13 there, or Matthew. Did I put down Mark? All right, so I messed up here. This was 4 in the morning, okay? So I'm just going to read out of the Bible. So Matthew 24. Well, Mark 13 is so similar. So, you could go there and see the same things. But so what I want to show you here, going through Matthew 24, is how this parallels perfect with Revelation 6. Okay, so what I want to do first, as we go through this, is show you that Revelation 6, Matthew 24 matches up perfectly. Okay, and you can do this in your own time as far as going through this. But in Matthew 24, it says in verse 4, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." And so it says basically the same thing in Matthew, or in Mark, I'm sorry. It says, "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And when you shall hear of wars and rumors of war, be not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet." And so go to Revelation 6 and keep that open with Matthew 24. And what I'm going to show you here is that we're going to see what the beginning of sorrows, actually the first 4 seals that are opened, is what the chart over there will say the tribulation, but really what the Bible calls this, and I'm not against that word being used for this because tribulation, sorrows, is pretty much the same thing, but a technical term for that would be this would be the beginning of sorrows. So that first 3.5 years, or the first 4 seals that we'll see, is what the Bible would call the beginning of sorrows. Okay? And so in Revelation 6 and verse 1, this is where they start opening up the seals. And again, what I believe is, what you see here is that it's not God pouring this stuff out. He basically has this book that has 7 seals. And as they're opening the seals, these events are going on. And once he opens that 7th seal, that's when there's, there's silence in heaven about the space of half an hour, and then God starts pouring out his wrath. So it's basically like God's getting ready to pour out his wrath, and he's opening up this book. And as he's opening up the book, these events are taking place, if you want to look at it that way. Okay? So he opens up the first seal. In verse 1 there, it says, And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, Come and see. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. Now, what did we see? The first thing that was mentioned in Matthew 24, that there's going to be people saying, I am Christ, and there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Okay? And what do you see the first seal? You see this person coming on a white horse. What type of horse does Jesus come on eventually? A white horse. So you see an imposter. You see someone that's trying to be Christ, right? By the white, with the white horse. But you also see the fact that he's going forth to conquer. He has a bow in his hand. What are you talking about with a bow? A bow and arrow, right? So it's a weapon of war. But he's basically going forth to conquering and to conquer. So he's basically warring, right? Wars and rumors of wars. Okay? So we see that matches up. The next thing that's said in Matthew 24. Now I'm back to Matthew. I got it right now. Okay, in my notes, I'm back to Matthew. So Matthew 24 and verse 7, it says, For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Okay? So let's see if that matches up with the next seal. So in Revelation 6 and verse 3, it says, And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. So this is clearly talking about nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom, because when you take peace from the earth, what's the opposite of peace? War. There's a time of peace and there's a time of war, and he has a great sword, and swords in the Bible, when it talks about you killed him with the sword of Ammon, it's talking about like with an army or win battle, and it's talking about that type of thing. And so we see that, well, the first two seals are really dealing with warfare, isn't it? You see, he's going forth to conquer. He's got a bow, so the bow and arrow, in the first one. Then you have the second one has a great sword, and he's taking peace from the earth. So really the first two are dealing with warfare. Isn't that what you see in Matthew 24? Wars, rumors of wars. Then nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Notice the next thing that it says in Matthew 24 and verse 7, it says, There shall be famines. Okay? There shall be famines. Let's see if that matches up with the third seal. So Revelation 6 and verse 5, and it says, And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. So you say, well, what in the world is that talking about? Well, we saw from already in Matthew, remember that they covenanted to work a day's work for how much? A penny. So what was a day's wage in this time? A penny. That means that a measure of wheat was sold for a day's wage. So what are you dealing with? Famine. There's a shortage in food. And it's basically saying there's a shortage in barley and there's a shortage in wheat. Now, for some reason, the oil and wine's still doing all right. So I don't have all the answers as far as why that's the case or what the significance of it that is. But all I'm saying is that this is clearly showing you famine. There's a shortage in supply of food. Okay, so famine matches up. So back to Matthew 24 and verse 7. Let's see if this one, because remember I said the first 4 seals, I believe, are the beginning of sorrows. It says in verse 7, In pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. And it says all these are the beginning of sorrow. So everything that happens that was just mentioned was all the beginning of sorrow. So it talks about pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Now look at Revelation 6 again, and let's look at the 4th seal. So in verse 7 there, it says, And when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto him over the 4th part of the earth to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. Okay? And so this, I believe, you can almost look at this as a culmination too, meaning that you think of the warfare, the famine, and all this stuff, but you can definitely see pestilence being in here, how he kills them with death, right? You can kind of think of the Black Plague, the bubonic plague. You can think of these different things where it's just death, it's a disease, it's stuff like that, right? Pestilences, that are killing people, beasts of the earth. And you can think about the fact that there's these earthquakes in diverse places. And not to go too deep with this, but in Revelation 12, that first 3.5 years where the dragon is going after the woman, that's what's going on in these. Notice that it says a fourth of the earth, right? It says that he gave him power over a fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword. Notice that it's just the earth, right? All this stuff is just affecting everybody, right? This has nothing to do with like going after Christians. This is just the whole world. That's what you see in Revelation 12 with the dragon going after it. But remember that there's this flood. And listen, I do believe that's talking about wars and stuff like that, which does talk about that here, talking about with the sword and all that stuff. But think about earthquakes in diverse places. What causes a tsunami? Earthquakes in the ocean, okay? Earthquakes in diverse places could cause tsunamis. So you can think of like just these catastrophes going on, okay, in the world. And you say, well, does the devil have this power? Is this God's wrath? Well, how about the devil caused the east wind to blow on Job's sons and daughters' house for where it collapsed on them and killed them? And Job is a great picture of end times. It talks about, we've heard of the patience of Job, talking about the tribulation of Job and how he lost everything, but then he was, given back, twice as much at the end. So Job is a great story dealing with tribulation and how we'll go through that. But do you see how that all fits? And again, when you're dealing with Revelation 6, it is a little more cryptic, okay? Meaning that you're dealing with these horses and, just different symbolistic type things that are going on there. But I do believe the beginning of the sorrows is what we would see as those first 4 seals. When we get to the 5th seal, I believe this is where you're dealing with the Great Tribulation. Okay, the 5th seal would be the Great Tribulation, and it would be and what kickstarts that is the abomination of desolation. So in Matthew 24, I'm going to actually read a lot here because it's actually that this portion of events, even though it's a short period of time, and as you see here, you're dealing with like 75 days of this. It's a short period of time, and it was shortened, what we'll see. Okay, so it was meant to go for 3.5 years, but it was shortened. It talks about that a lot, okay, because this is where the rubber meets the road. At this point, you're kind of just dealing with some really hard times in the world, right, the beginning of sorrows. And here's the thing. With that, can you really know for sure that it's the end, right? Has there been times of war? Always, right? Has there been times of pestilences and famines and different things like that? Of course there has. And so you can look at that. Now, I do believe this is going to be amplified. I think it's going to be kind of stepped up to another notch, right, than the typical. But you still wouldn't maybe know. You just like, there's some crazy stuff going on in the world. It's pretty bad right now. And you can definitely see how they're going to try to bring in a one world government because everything's kind of just really bad. And we're just like, we need a savior to fix it, right? But in Matthew 24, in verse 9, this is where I believe you get into that 5th seal. And so in Matthew 24, in verse 9, it says, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake." That's the switch. So when you go to Revelation 12 to Revelation 13, what's the switch? Now he's not just going after all the living. He's going after all those of the remnant of her seed that keep the testimony of Jesus Christ and keep his commandments. See the switch, how he's narrowing it down? And what are we dealing with here? Now we're dealing with people that are under the name of Christ, right? That they hate and are trying to kill you because, for Christ's name's sake, right? In verse 10 there it says, "And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." Man, don't we see that today? This is a side note. But iniquity just abounds in our country, and the love of many have waxed cold. And you just think about how people get upset about all these stupid things in the world, from a baseball game to all this other stuff, but they don't care that babies are being murdered. They don't care about the wickedness that's going on in the world and who's being affected by it. And so you can definitely see how that applies in the end times. But in verse 13 there it says, But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Okay, so this is where people rip this out of context. Be like, see, you got to endure unto the end to go to heaven, right? Well, you got to read it all and see what it's talking about, right? In verse 14 it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." And by the way, YouTube, could kick us off YouTube. You can kick us off Facebook. You can kick us off Twitter. I don't have Twitter, but if you kick us off all these social media programs. But listen, you will not stop this verse right here. This verse is saying that the gospel is going to be preached to every nation, to all nations at this time. Okay? So when Jesus comes, when this goes down, everybody is going to have heard the gospel, or it's going to be preached to all nations. They're going to be without excuse. And, they can try to slow it down as much as they want, but it's going to happen. Okay? So that's a side note, a little commercial break. Now, verse 15, it says, "And when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation," spoken of Daniel the prophet, "stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let him which is in Judea flee into the mountains." So notice that he's kind of starting off saying, hey, you had the beginning of sorrows, right, where you're dealing with all these different things. And then it says, then. Well, so what's then mean? After this, right? After this. So then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted. So it's going straight into what I believe would be the fifth seal. But then it kind of kicks back and says, when you see the abomination of desolation, that's when you know this is going to happen. Okay? And so it says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. You say, why? Well, that's where it's happening. Okay? The abomination of desolation is going to happen in Jerusalem. Okay? You say, well, they're not done with the Jews yet. They're not done with Jerusalem. You're right. The Antichrist is going to be dealing with it, right? There is going to be something that happens there, but it's not godly. Okay? It's going to be wicked. And actually, Jesus says, flee from that place, okay, if you're in Judea. But then it says in verse 17, "Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." So notice how when it says, "He that endureth unto the end, the same shall be saved," see how it's talking about the same event that's going on? Because then it says, "Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved." So basically what it's saying is that technically it could have gone on for longer, because we know from our timeline, right, that at the abomination of desolation, how long does the Antichrist have power? 42 months. That's 3.5 years. And what we see from the timeline, from what Daniel's going to show us, is that actually 75 days into that 42 months is when the rapture is going to happen. Okay? So those days were shortened, weren't they? So from 1260 to 75. Okay? And that shows you how intense it is. Because if he didn't shorten it, we wouldn't make it. You wouldn't have made it 3.5 years through that. That's how intense that tribulation will be. And so that means that there's going to be people that are going to die, but not everybody. Not everybody's going to, there's going to be people that are going to be saved, that are going to be caught up in the rapture and all that. Now, how does that fit with the fifth seal? We'll go to Revelation 6 again. So, when you deal with the beginning of sorrows, it kind of gives you little statements. But this fifth seal, it gives you a lot of information. Okay, it tells you how it's going to start with the abomination of desolation. It tells you what's going to happen during that. What? You're going to be afflicted and killed for the cause of Christ, for the name of Christ. What do you see in Revelation 6, verse 9? "And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God, and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto every one of them. And it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled." So as this fifth seal is open, what do you see? You see the blood, you see the souls of those that were slain for the word of God. Doesn't that fit with what happens right after, the fourth seal and stuff that's going on with pestilences and all that stuff? And notice that it says too, because this really shows you that the first four seals cannot be the wrath of God. Okay? Because it says in verse 10 there, how long, O Lord, and holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? Has God avenged any blood on the earth at that point? No. That wouldn't make any sense for them to say that. And God replies in saying, basically giving them white robes, that they're going to have to rest a little season until, meaning that there's going to have to be other people that die before he does it. Okay? And so, basically, the fifth seal I see is the Great Tribulation. You see, basically, the abomination desolation would happen at that point. The Great Tribulation is going down. And, what do we see in Matthew 24 after that? Well, we see the sun and moon darkened, right? But before we get to that, there's kind of like this little interlude basically talking about Christ coming. Because you can imagine, because that's what we're going to get into, but it's talking about his coming, meaning that it's interesting because this chapter actually tells you that it's not going to be a secret. Okay? That's why the pre-trib rapture is so dumb on so many levels. It's so wrong and so just ridiculous. Okay? You have to take Matthew 24 and just pretty much rip it out of your Bible. You know how many acrobats they have to do on this? It literally tells you this will not be a secret when Jesus comes. But what is the big thing? It's coming at any moment, and people are going to be like, what happened? Planes are crashing, because, listen, there's not that many saved people out there anyway. Okay, planes will be fine. I doubt there's many planes where both the co-pilot, the pilot, and the navigator are all saved. Okay, it's probably not happening. Anyway. So all I have to say is that, this whole Left Behind stuff, it's just ridiculous. But the Bible actually rebukes it in many places. We already saw it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where it says, that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and the man of sin be revealed. So it's saying, don't let any man deceive you that it can be at hand. But notice in verse 23 of Matthew 24, it says, then if any man shall say unto you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. Now, first of all, notice that how false Christs and false prophets are coming first. Now, do you see how that makes sense that the Antichrist would come before Christ comes back? When he keeps saying, hey, listen, there's going to be people that say, I am Christ. That's how this chapter even started. They're going to say, I am Christ. So you have the Antichrist showing up. And what is the Antichrist? Basically, the person that's in Christ's stead. The person who rejects that Jesus is the Christ, but they're basically saying they are the Christ. Okay? And even in 1 John chapter 4, it says, ye know that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists. So when it says here there's going to be false Christs, there's going to be false prophets, that makes sense, right? They're already here. Okay? There's plenty of false prophets and false Christs. You say, false Christ? Who's claiming? There's people that believe they're the Son of God. Okay? That's why Richie fled from the Philippines, right? Because the guy that says he's the Son of God lost sleep over Richie's sermon. Okay? Anyway, so all that to say is that there are people that say they are the Christ, and people actually swallow it. They actually believe it. Now, keep going from there. In verse 25 it says, behold, I have told you before, wherefore if they shall say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, notice this, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. And even saying, listen, it's not a secret, my friends. He's not in the secret chambers, and he's not in your secret rapture either. Okay? The pre-trib rapture is just pure foolishness. It's nowhere in the Bible, and it's actually rebuked in the Bible. Anything that's being taught about that is rebuked. Notice it says, this is the way that the coming of Christ is going to be. Okay? So he's saying it's not in some secret chamber. He's not in the desert over here. He's not over here where people aren't going to see it. Notice in verse 27, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. He's basically saying it's like the lightning in the sky. You're going to miss that? And if you don't get that, Revelation chapter 1 verse 7 says, and behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him. And it says, and they also which pierced him. So not only that, I actually believe that the people that killed Christ are actually going to see him come in the clouds. So it's going to be a supernatural event where everybody's seeing Christ coming in the clouds. So it's definitely not a secret. Okay? This whole idea, we're raptured out and people are like, what's going on? And no, they're going to be mourning and weeping and wailing. if they don't get caught up in the rapture. That's what's going to happen. That's what the Bible actually teaches about it. There's not going to be planes crashing and stuff, and there's going to be fire and brimstone coming down is what's going to happen. The day that we're taken out, fire and brimstone comes out. I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't got to that in the chapter yet. But, going back to Matthew 24 there, or you're still in Matthew 24, we're going to see the sixth seal. Okay, so we saw the fifth seal was what? The Great Tribulation. The first four seals would be called the beginning of sorrows, or what you would see on that chart, the first four seals, tribulation. The fifth seal, the Great Tribulation, and the sixth seal is going to be basically that's after the tribulation, okay? After the tribulation and the day that God starts pouring out his wrath, okay? That's the day we're raptured. So a lot happens on that day, okay? We're raptured out, and then he starts pouring out his wrath on the earth. Now, Matthew 24, this is where we get that we believe that the rapture happens after the tribulation, because that's actually what it says. Okay? That film, After the Tribulation, that's actually a quote from the Bible. Okay? Show me before the tribulation anywhere in the Bible, or anything even close to that, you won't find it. Matthew 24 and verse 29, it says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see these things, see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." So notice what's seen here. What happens before Jesus comes in the clouds? You say, well, this is his second coming. There's no mention of a white horse here, by the way. He's coming in the clouds. There's a trumpet sounding. He's gathering together his elect. That is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 to a T. Okay? And notice here, though, I want you to see this. After the tribulation, what happens? The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. Look at Revelation chapter 6. So let's look at that sixth seal. And you're going to see that this happens boom, 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 all the way down the line. Matthew 24, Revelation chapter 6 is lock and step. Okay? And if you didn't see it with the other stuff, you will see it now. Okay? There's no doubt that the sixth seal is what happens after the tribulation. Okay? And if you can't see that, come talk to me later, and I'll gently lead you into the right way, right? But in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, "And behold, when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a" what? "Fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said unto the mountains and rocks, Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" That's the day of the Lord, my friends. And actually, if you look at this is lock and step with everything in the Bible from Old Testament, New Testament. When it comes to the day of the Lord, what happens before that? The sun and moon are darkened. Joel chapter 2 says it. Isaiah says it. The New Testament reiterates that. Acts chapter 2 reiterates Joel chapter 2, saying that before the great and terrible day of the Lord come, the sun and moon are darkened, and the stars are going to fall from heaven. Not only that, but in Revelation chapter 6, notice that it says that what's falling, when it talks about the stars of heaven fell into the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs. And what does it say in Matthew 24? It talks about, now learn a parable of the fig tree. Okay? Why does it say that? Because it's calling you back to that. And not only that, but this is also mentioned in Isaiah, talking about the day of the Lord. And it also mentions that the heavens are going to depart as a scroll. I don't have time. I could probably do a whole sermon on the sun and moon being darkened and the day of the Lord and how that happens. So the day of the Lord, what is the day of the Lord? That's what we're looking for, right? And you'll hear all the preachers, we're waiting for the day of the Lord, brother. The day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. Right? You know, the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night, and it keeps saying that. But what does the Bible say? The Bible says that the sun and moon are darkened before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Before. When is the tribulation? After the tribulation, the sun and moon are darkened. Do you see how that's a pivotal movement right there, right? You have the tribulation, sun and moon are darkened, day of the Lord. Day of the Lord, sun and moon darkened, tribulation. How in the world do you get, the rapture, which is the day of the Lord, over here before the tribulation? You can't do it, okay? And so the sun and moon are darkened, it's pivotal. And how can you look at Matthew 24 and Revelation 6 and say that's not the same event? Because what they're going to say, what the pre-tribbers are going to say is that, well, Matthew 24, that's talking about when Jesus comes on a white horse in Revelation 19. Do you see any trumpet mentioned? Do you see any clouds mentioned? Do you see a sun being darkened? Do you see the moon being darkened? Do you see the stars falling from it? Do you see any of that in Revelation chapter 19? You don't see any of that, okay? And so, I think it's super clear. Super clear that, and listen, when I was in college, I was a sophomore in college, so I was probably saved for like 2 or 3 years at this point. And this is one of the first things that I saw reading through Matthew. I remember Brother Stuckey and I, we were actually living in the same apartment. And I remember us taking Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, and we're like, boom, it's there. And no one ever taught us that, okay? This is way before I ever knew Pastor Anderson. And all the people I listened to, every preacher that I listened to was pre-trib. And I respected a lot of the preachers that I listened to, but they were all pre-trib. But when I actually read the Bible and saw what it said just plain as day, how can you come out of Matthew 24 and think that the rapture happens before the tribulation? I mean, anybody that understands grammar is going to understand that that's not there. Now, you say, well, how do they, are these people want to say, no, listen, a lot of people just want to be ignorant about it. A lot of people have a lot of pride. And they don't like some young guy telling them that they're wrong, okay? And then they have their Zionist agenda too, because this goes clearly against Zionism, okay? There's a lot that's rolled into dispensationalism, Zionism, all of that stuff's rolled right into, I want the pre-trib to be true, or it's going to basically destroy all those other doctrines, okay? Now, go back to Matthew 24, because I do want to get through this whole chapter. But that's one big thing I wanted to show you there, is that Revelation 6, Matthew 24, I believe fit lock and step. I think the big thing, honestly, I could have taken you to the sixth seal and showing you the sun and moon dark, and I think that would have been the key that you would definitely have seen it. But I think if you go back and look at those other seals with what's said before that, you'll see how that all lines up, okay? Now, in Matthew 24 and verse 36, notice what it says, and they'll quote this and say, well, see, this could come at any moment. It says in verse 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Okay? So they'll take this, but here's the thing, what day are you talking about? You can't just rip this out of context and just say that, right? What day are you talking about? The day of my birthday? I mean, the day of what? Obviously, the day that was just talked about how Jesus is coming in the clouds. Okay? And so, you could say, well, we're not going to know the day or the hour, but you're going to know that it's after the tribulation. You're going to know that it's after the sun and moon are darkened. There's certain things that have to happen before you get to that. And you remember that it said also, it says, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. And so, when you see the sun and moon darkened, guess what? That generation is not going to pass until all these things be fulfilled. That's what it's saying. You could maybe take it back to even the beginning of basically the abomination of desolation, right? Because that would be true, right? But I would say, he's basically kind of pointing back at after the tribulation, when the sun and moon are darkened, that generation is not going to pass, right? Because it's happening that day. But also it says, then it's nigh, even at the doors. So there is going to be a time when it's at hand. Right? When you see the sun and moon darken, guess what? Lift up your heads, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. It's at the doors. It's at hand. Because it's not that you can never say that it's at hand. It just means that certain things have to happen before you can. And people are like, well, you don't know the day or the hour. That means it could happen at any moment. Did I know the day or the hour that my child was going to be born? Well, let me ask you this. Was I surprised that my child was born this week? I was like, man, I didn't even know you were pregnant. How did that happen? Listen, don't give me this anomaly where some really overweight woman had a child and did not know she was pregnant, okay? I know that exists. Stop it, okay? We're talking about, not talking about exceptions that are out there. Most all women know that they're pregnant, and but you know the timeline, right? About 9 months, right? And the Bible says this is the time of life, right? It kind of just gives it that kind of terminology. But go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, because they'll take you to this where it says, well, no man don't know the day or the hour, brother, so therefore it can happen at any moment. That's ridiculous, okay? Because I can say that, we're going to have an event in the fall, but I don't know the day or the hour that it's going to happen. Does that mean that it's going to happen in the summer? Right? I mean, even if you said in 3 months we're going to do this, and you gave like a timeline, in 3 months we're going to do this, but I don't know the day or the hour. Well, it can't be in 4 months then, and it can't be in 2 months, because you just said it was going to be in 3 months. So do you see how that's ridiculous, how you can say, well, it can happen at any moment because you don't know the day or the hour, okay? Case in point, the Bible actually uses this terminology of a woman in travail or a woman giving birth when dealing with the day of the Lord. Isn't that just interesting, right? So in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, but of the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. Now, why is he saying that? Well, he was just talking, what is he talking about? He's talking about the rapture, right? Because in chapter 4, he just got done saying that, the Lord's going to descend with a shout, talking about how we're going to be caught up together in the clouds. And he's basically saying, of the times of the season you have no need that I write unto you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. And what I'm going to say to you is that you can know the times and the seasons, but you're not going to know the day or the hour, okay? You're not going to know exactly when that's going to happen, okay? In verse 3 there, it says, for when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. So people try to say, well, he's coming as a thief in the night, that means he can come at any moment. Wait a minute, it says that it's not going to overtake us as a thief. So that means it can't happen at any moment for us, right? If that's your logic, right, that he's coming as a thief in the night, therefore it can happen at any moment, then for Christians it doesn't happen at any moment, because it's not going to overtake us as a thief. You got to be consistent with your logic. But second of all, it's saying that we're going to know the times and the seasons, but it's going to come a thief unto the unsaved. That's what it's saying, right? It's going to take them as a thief, because they're going to say peace and safety. They're going to think everything's fine. They're going to be eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. They're going to think everything's just fine and dandy, and then sudden destruction happens like that. So it's going to take them as a thief. But, the times and seasons is just like having a child, okay? I knew when they said the due date was. I didn't believe it, but I knew when they said it was, right? Because at first it was supposed to be June 24th, and it said July. Then they're like, well, we looked at the ultrasound July 1st. June 18th is when Emma came, right? So I don't think, listen, first of all, I don't know of anybody that's ever had it on their due date, except unless you had an actual scheduled C-section, okay? And that doesn't count as far as it happening on your due date, okay? You can't use that as an example. Having a natural birth that happens on the due date, I haven't seen it. I'm not saying it hasn't never happened, okay? But I've never seen it. It's never happened with my children. I've never known anybody that it has happened to. It's always been early, late, whatever. At least a day, okay? So all that says is you're not going to know the day or the hour. And even if you knew the day, they don't give you the hour. They'll give you July 1st, but did they ever say it's going to be at July 1st at 10 a.m.? Be there. They'd be crazy to say something like that. So you can definitely see why it's saying that, because you're going to know, hey, we're in the season, right? It's kind of like, I know it's in fall. It isn't I'm just using that as an example because fall is kind of reference to the end times, harvest. I know it's in fall. That means it can't happen in summer, okay? That means it can't happen in spring and it can't happen in winter. It has to happen in fall. I don't know what day it's going to be, and I don't know what hour it's going to be, but I know it's going to happen in fall. And certain things, listen, summer has to come before fall, and spring has to come before summer. So there has to be a fallen away first, and the man of sin has to be revealed, and then you can say, okay, now make it happen somewhere. When I see the abomination of desolation, I can say, well, because here's the thing. You say, well, we know that it's 75 days from the timelines, and we're going to get to that when we get to Daniel chapter 12. But do you really know when the abomination of desolation took down? And let me ask you a question. Are you going to have a calendar and be looking at the watch when that happens? And be like, listen, we're going to be like refugees, okay? We're going to be fleeing for our lives. We're going to be trying to just survive, let alone be knowing what day of the week it is. Listen, I don't know what day of the week it is right now. No, I know it's Wednesday, okay? If it wasn't for church, I wouldn't know because, when it comes to if you're busy doing something or you're in a high tense situation, do you really know what time of day it is or what day it is of the week or what day of the month it is? Listen, how many people know what day of the month it is right now? Without looking at your phone, what day of the month is it right now? I know because my child was born yesterday, but normally I don't know, and I have to be I'm looking at my calendar. When you sign stuff, you're like, what day is it? So that's why, you're probably not going to know even the day. But one day you may. If the day of Christ isn't now, and I know I'm going off on a tangent, I got other things to hit, but I think this is an important point to make. If the day of Christ is not at hand, and it's wrong to say that now, but after, let's say, the falling away happens and the man of sin is revealed, is it wrong to say that then? And let me ask you a question. After the abomination of desolation, would it be wrong then to say, I know the day? Maybe not, because Jesus doesn't even know the day or the hour. It says in Mark, it says not the Son, but the Father only. Do you think Jesus is not going to know eventually? Okay, he's the one that's coming. Okay, now, all that to say is that, and like I said, just because it says it doesn't necessarily mean it's to the T. Okay, because sometimes when it says days, as we see with 3 days, it doesn't necessarily mean 3 full days. Okay, so you may not know exactly when. And not to mention, you're not probably going to be paying attention. You're going to be just like, I just need to try to survive, right? Anyway, where am I at my notes here? Now, go to Matthew 24, verse 37. So, Jesus is giving a comparison of Noah. In Luke chapter 17, he also gives a comparison of Lot, dealing with how it's going to be when Christ is going to come back. Now, in Matthew 24 and verse 37, it says, but as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that in the days that were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now it says the same thing, and for sake of time, because I'm kind of dragging along here, Luke 17 talks about Noah, but then it goes into Lot. Same pretty much thing, right? In the days of Lot, they were building, planting, marrying, giving in marriage. Okay, so it's kind of like they're saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction, right? Because the day that Noah went into the ark, the flood came, and the day that Lot came out of Sodom, God destroyed it, right? And that's what happens when the sun and moon are darkened. When we're raptured up, guess what? The same day he's pouring fire down on the earth. Okay, so that he's giving an illustration with that, but I do believe you could also see what was going on in Noah's day in the world. There was violence. That's the number one thing that you see in Genesis chapter 6, that there was violence throughout the land. And do I need to really say what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay. What's going on here in June, right? In the month of June. So just filth, wickedness, perversion, violence, what's going on. So you can definitely see that's what's going to be happening in the end time. So what's the signs of the times, that type of stuff. But, they're going to be thinking it's all fine and dandy, then sudden destruction comes upon them as a woman in travail. Meaning it's just going to hit them all suddenly. Thief in the night, and they're going to be taken out. Now, look at Matthew 24, verse 40, and I want to explain this. So he's going to get into talking about the rapture, but he's kind of really he's teaching a point here. So he's not just teaching what's going to happen when the rapture happens, meaning that some people are going to be raptured and some aren't. And in Matthew 24 and verse 40, it says, then shall 2 be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. 2 women shall be grinding at the mill. The one shall be taken and the other left. Now in Luke it also even says 2 men shall be in one bed, one shall be taken, one shall be left. Okay. Then it says in verse 42, watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. So we're talking about the day of the Lord, right, when he comes. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore, be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. So what's this teaching? Well, all these cases, the one that's being taken, the other that's left, are next to each other. And what he's saying is that you don't want your house to be broken up. Okay? So think about the story of Noah and the story of Lot. Noah saved his whole family. They were all saved. His 3 sons and his 3 daughter-in-laws and his wife. They were all saved. His house was not broken up. What about Lot? See, Noah was a righteous man. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now, Lot was he vexed his righteous soul, but was he Abraham? Was he like Noah? Do you look at Lot and be like, that's a godly man I want to be like when you pitch his tent toward Sodom, right? He was saved, but his wife was turned into a pillar of salt. Only 2 of his daughters were saved, and they committed incest after that. And at least 2 other daughters died at Sodom because when he talked to his sons-in-law, they thought he was mocking to them. Why? Because he's living in the world, and then he starts preaching to them the gospel, right? And they're just like, who's this guy preaching to me, right? Why would I listen to you? And they mocked him. They thought he was mocking. Like, why in the world would you even bring that up? What happened? Lot's house was broken up. So this isn't talking about like, hey, you need to be right with God and walking with God or you're not going to make it. It's talking about your family. Now, this can be true in your day, meaning like even if we're not talking about end times, listen, you don't know when your children are going to die. You don't know when you're going to die. Listen, that can come as a thief in the night, right? Death can come at any moment. Therefore, you need to make sure that your house is ready, okay? And so I think the examples of Noah and Lot are on a lot of levels, okay? Talking about how sudden the destruction came, what was going on in their day, but also what happened to their family. And so when you see, the good man in the house, if he would have known what hour, he wouldn't have suffered his house to be broken up. But what happened? With Noah, he made sure his family was safe, made sure they got on the ark, made sure they survived, and then Lot didn't. And his house was broken up because of it. Now, also when you're dealing with this, when it talks about being ready and watching, what you have to understand is that, spiritually speaking, we're all ready. Okay, go to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And the last part I may get into when we go to Matthew 25, because dealing with the wise servant and the evil servant, because it really does tie in with all the stories in Matthew 25, because I'm getting down on time here. So, but in Mark 14, this is when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, we know the typical phrase, which is what? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Notice what it says in Mark 14, verse 37. It says, And he cometh and findeth them sleeping, and saith unto Peter, Simon, sleepest thou? Couldst thou not watch 1 hour? Watch ye and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. The spirit truly is what? Ready, but the flesh is weak. See, our souls are ready. If you're saved, you're ready. It doesn't matter if you're not in church. It doesn't matter if you're not reading your Bible. You're ready, meaning that if Jesus came back, you're going to be caught up because you're saved. But is your flesh ready? Because we're talking about the physical, right? And this all goes into walking in a new man, not walking in the old man. And so it's basically saying he's calling you to action. He's saying you're the children of light. That's what it says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. In verse 5 it says, Ye are all the children of light and the children of day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep. So notice how he's saying you are children of light. You're children of the day. You're not of the night. But don't walk, like basically it kind of seems like, why would he be saying it? Because your soul and your spirit is that, but you have to choose to walk in it. That's why it says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8, it says, For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. And I've hit on this many times. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. If you've received Him, also walk ye in Him. And if you are the children of light, then walk as the children of light. Meaning that the walking is something that you have to do after you get saved, and it's not just saying you're saved. So meaning that you are the children of light, your spirit is ready, you are sober and watching spiritually, but are you doing that physically? If you're not doing it physically, that's where you're going to have problems, okay? And what's the consequences of that? Your family, your house being broken up, other people, your friends that you may know, that you work with. Think about it. A lot of these things that they're doing, they're working with people in the field, your co-workers, your friends, your family, will they, and you can think of this obviously in the end times, right? If you're down in the Great Tribulation, basically saying, I don't want my family to be broken up, I'm going to make sure they get saved before it all goes down. But just think about this in life in general. What if we weren't in the end times? What if that didn't happen for hundreds of years? You can still think of it in that aspect of, I'm not going to be here forever. They're not going to be here forever. Therefore, you got to watch and be sober and do what you need to do now. Okay? I hope that helps make sense of what's being said there, because sometimes you'll see that and be like, what does that mean? Like, we're being commanded to watch, and we need to be ready. What if we're not ready? Right? Because you may ask yourself, well, like, what if we're not? Right? If it's saying, be ready and be sober and don't sleep, what if we do? And notice how in Mark 14, what's happening? They're supposed to be watching, and what are they doing? They're sleeping. See how it lines up with, your spirit is ready, but the flesh is weak. And the key is to take that spirit and make that flesh strong through the spirit, right? Basically starve the flesh, but basically walk through the body with the spirit to where that's all ready. Basically soul, body, and spirit's ready, okay? And Matthew 24 at the end there, and I'll get into this next week when we go into Matthew 25. It kind of gives this dichotomy of the faithful and wise servant and how he's doing what he should be doing when his Lord cometh. And then it talks about this evil, wicked servant not doing what his Lord commanded, and he's beating and all this stuff. I'm going to say this. One's saved and one's lost. This evil servant is not a saved person. He's not a believer. Because at the end it talks about how he's going to be given his portion with the hypocrites, and there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We're going to see this happen in 3 different stories in Matthew 25. And remember, Matthew 25 is really the end of everything he's saying, right? We go from the end of Matthew 24, it's going straight into Matthew 25. There's no, he went somewhere else and talked to them. This is the same, discourse that he's giving. So really, the end of Matthew 24 here with this wise servant compared to the evil servant, you're going to see the 10 virgins, the 5 wise virgins, 5 foolish virgins. Then you're going to see the story of the talents. You're going to see the 2 of them, 2 of the servants did what they should, 1 didn't. One's cast into outer darkness. Then you're going to see the sheep and the goats. One has everlasting life, the other is going to be an eternal punishment. So we're going to see that, and it's probably better that I wait for that anyway, because it's going to tie in pretty well with what's said. And I'm going to show you without a shadow of a doubt that evil servant is not a saved person, okay? It's not. So, people will go to that type of stuff, and they'll say, well, this evil servant over here, he's cast into outer darkness, therefore I can lose my salvation. It's like, oh, that's the clearest passage I could ever think of for salvation, right? And so I do want to answer that and go through that. And when I think I taught on that when I did the whole sermon on the parable of the talents, the servants with the talents. So actually, Matthew 25, I preached 2/3 of that chapter already, because I did a sermon on the virgins and I did a sermon on the talents, but I did not hit the sheep and the goats. Okay, so next week I'm going to kind of focus in on that. I'm going to kind of hit that stuff at the beginning, but really focus on the last part of it because I haven't preached on it before. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this evening and pray that you'd be with us as we go throughout the week, and just pray for safe travels. And I pray that you be with those that aren't feeling well. I pray that you be with my wife with the new baby, and pray you be with us as we transition to having 3. And Lord, again, I thank you for everybody that's out here this evening. I pray that you bless us. We love you and pray all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.